You all look comfortable. I like how there's light over here and there's light over there, but not here. So I'm going to stand here the whole time. No, we'll see if I can dive back and forth between them fast enough. So I'm going to talk about code patterns for pattern making. We've been talking about style guides. To me, one of the most important things about a style guide is the maintainable patterns that we build in it. And for my team, at least, a lot of that happens in the code. We've had a lot of talks on style guides already. We're going to have more. They're going to overlap a lot, but I want to focus in. So style guides are for clarity, consistency, efficiency. We all know this. I had an early experience with documentation. If you don't document something, it doesn't exist. I learned that. This was one of my first docs. This is when I first released Suzy, and I had no idea what I was doing. This was just an example of how to use it. And Chris Epstein looked at that and built it and wrote back and said, "Are you serious? This is the thing?" The documentation made no sense at all. It didn't do anything. At that point, I had no programming skills. I still mostly do artsy shit. I had no original ideas. The whole thing was based on Natalie Downs' ideas. I had no plan and no stinking badges. Really, there were no badges back then. Now we've got badges for everything. 35 followers, no GitHub account. You can see the first Suzy post was from my brother, who was nice enough to put it on GitHub for me. He told me what open source was and that it should be there, and I said, okay, cool, that's great. What I'm trying to get to and not is that context matters. And I'm not going to be building Lightning Design System because I'm in a different context than Salesforce. And it's a beautiful design system, and it works way differently than anything I'm ever going to build. And we're both doing it right, hopefully. There's not one way. Context, what your team is doing, who you're working for. This is my team. Well, we've grown a little bit up, I guess. We've grown up. Those are my brothers and me playing, doing a card sort. So now we're a team of 4 or 5, depending which week it is. How many of you here are on small teams, like under 10? Okay, a fair number. And how many of you are on like over 200? Larger teams. Okay, great. Yeah, so I built Suzy thinking that it was the right answer at some point, and then I realized later on it was a great answer for teams that are doing consulting, moving from one project to the next. And I don't know about enterprise teams. I'm not on one. I don't know what you do with 200 people. I'm used to working with 5. That matters. It's a difference, and you're going to have different results. Also, whether you're internal or consulting, you get there's different stresses, different things you have to deal with. I'm not throwing over the wall to anybody. When I design something, I then have to build it, and then nobody else touches my code. So it's very different. We all have similar problems. We're all solving very similar things. So I'm solving the same problems that Lightning Design System is in some ways. And we all also have unique constraints. So we end up with very different tools. And your mileage will vary. Somebody said small bootstrap something, every website or something. It wasn't Brad Frost. He mentioned it. I couldn't remember. I looked it up. This is it. Tiny bootstraps for every client. Great. I found it. I like that. And I first found this idea when I watched Natalie Downs' talk way back, 2008, 2009 sometime. And I feel like every talk I've done since then has been a variant of her talk, so I always have to give her some credit. Suzy was built around her ideas. She's brilliant. But what she was saying early on was that we don't need frameworks that have all the opinions for us. We need systems for building those opinions into each site on a customized basis in a quick way so we can build every tiny bootstraps for every project. So in the end, my team is very small, and we're taking on clients, and we're taking on one client after another, and we're doing very fast handoff, and then we don't see the project again, maybe. And so really the architecture that we build for pattern making is going to make a huge difference, because this is going to an internal team, and then they're going to do anything that they want with it. And if I don't build the pattern right, which sometimes I haven't, if I don't build the pattern right, it's all going to fall apart 2 weeks after I'm gone. So it's very important that the architecture is what we're selling them. And quality architecture is just patterns in code. Documenting it on a style, if a style guide is just documentation, that's not enough. People will forget about it, they'll ignore it. We need to actually have code patterns in the code. And I failed on this at some points. We're about to be hired to go back and look at a site we built in 2010, and I know there's no code patterns in there. And I know, I mean, the site looks like there's patterns, but they don't exist in the code. And I'm going to have to deal with that now. So great, did that to myself. Patterns that we see in a style guide. Somebody mentioned earlier that style guides are unit tests, and I think that's great. I think also they're integration tests, in that they come from lots of different patterns being combined together to become what you see finally in the browser. What you see in the browser is a combination of design, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then also data. So you have to get the whole team on board, and the pattern has to be integrated across all of this. And one of the nice things about the way style guides are often done is that they often show these relationships, and that's really important. The relationships between components, but also the relationships that create the components. So maintenance also of the style guide has to be integrated. And I could have done another Brad Frost slide here, moving the style guide from an attached thing to something that's part of the process. Because if the style guide is not part of the process, it will slowly fade away. So that involves the process that we're all going through, also the toolkits that we use, and I'm really into toolkits. So I like to focus on that. Also making sure that the style guide is in the way and visible and easy to get to. We'll talk about that more later. There shouldn't be any silos. That was mentioned earlier. I don't remember exactly what they said, but I quoted it anyway. Yeah, and somebody also said, oh yeah, Brad Frost again, said something about a pattern API. I love that. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. That's what we're trying to build, is an API for developers to continue working on a project using the API, the patterns we've already designed for them. So I'm going to cover just really quickly a couple of the basics of what's become known as CSS architecture. And I feel like maybe there's a problem in how much we focused in on architecting CSS and leaving out a lot of the rest of the front end in how we think about that architecture. It seems to me that HTML patterns are usually the core of any architecture, and the CSS is just hooking into that. And we should be worried about architecting good HTML, and it's basically the same rules. All of these tools you've seen, Atomic, it's CSS, inverted triangle CSS is a newer one that's not had as much attention, but it's great. SMAX, OO, CSS, BEM. They all have slightly different approaches. They all have slightly different naming guidelines. But basically, they give you the same set of rules. And they're all great for somebody. I like mixing them all together and creating my own. Because parts of each work for my team and parts don't. And there's no one right way. So one of those rules is that you keep concerns separated, and that can get confusing. What is presentation, what is logic, what is structure? Those lines aren't hard, but you have to find them and find what works for your team to keep things, let's say, siloed. And the whole way along, always, specificity is the guide. Specificity is how you move through things. And that's what Atomic design is built around, building from smaller to larger. I like to think of it the way inverted triangle CSS talks about it. You've got the reach of a hook and its specificity and explicitness. When you're being explicit, that's when you can be more specific. When you're talking about a very narrow pattern that's used in very specific ways, then you're getting down towards the deep end of that triangle. But in a lot of ways, CSS is built around the top, the shallow end. And how can we stay very unspecific and create classes that apply broadly across our site? CSS was designed for that. That was the whole purpose. So we had our styles inline, and that was too specific. And so CSS was developed as a way of saying, let's give ourselves a shallow end. Let's design patterns. That's what classes are for. Classes are patterns. So we already have that. It's in CSS. We don't have to fight the cascade. We don't have to fight against specificity in order to create patterns in CSS. And I think, in my mind, a lot of the big enterprise architectures do try to make the cascade go away, please. And I don't think that's a great idea. I think we use it. We don't want to repeat ourselves, which is a good rule. But at the same time, we don't want to stretch for patterns. It's not enough to say these two elements share a border style, and so I'm going to make a pattern of this border style that's going to be shared between these two elements. We have to look at the reason that they share the border style and say, otherwise it's too fragile, and say, do these share a purpose that gives them the border style? And if they share that purpose, then we can create a pattern. And then when we want to represent that pattern differently, we can say, okay, no, it's not going to be a border style that they share. It's going to be a background that they share. And it still works. The pattern still works because they're sharing something meaningful. And that's important. Patterns should be meaningful. This is, again, another quote that is not accurate. I don't remember exactly how she said this. Natalie Weizenbaum, the main designer of Sass, there's a lot of controversy around using @extend in Sass. And she said, it works great when it's used semantically to represent something is a something. That's what it was built for. That's where it works well. And the main place that it's breaking is where people use it to try to represent things that have no meaning behind them. So build one-offs. Somebody said that earlier. Looks like it was Nathan. Yeah, I already said this, so I guess we'll just move on. For example, Susie was trying to solve a problem with making grid math meaningful, finding grid patterns and making that meaningful, so that when I look at the code, I don't see that top code where it's all the math required. It's not actually real complex math, but it looks ugly. And if I put that math in my code, nobody would have any idea what it means. And if I just put those results in my code, nobody would know what those mean either. But if I can write some code that is actually saying what I intend to get, then I've added meaning to my code, I've added readability to my code, and that's what gives it maintainability. That's what patterns are for. I don't really use grids anymore. I don't think you really need them. But there you go. There's meaningful ones. So naming conventions are also part of that, and very important. And we try to keep naming conventions consistent across the entire team, and that includes the back end and the database. Because often you'll get confused between the back-end developer using one term for something and the front-end developer using another term for something. And even that causes regular confusion. So we try to keep naming conventions consistent through everybody. And that doesn't necessarily trickle down to whether you're using dashes or underscores, but at least things are called the same thing. And so part of a naming convention should be making sure that in the patterns of naming things, we're making it clear what they are. So for us, that's often, layout regions have a pattern. So we can say, okay, we can very easily see when we're dealing with a layout region as compared to a component. And that difference is clear in the name. Components have elements. I mean, you can break these things down in different ways. Maybe that's blocks have elements. Maybe that's organisms have molecules. Things have states. So the is dash pattern from Smax is great. You know, if you see is dash or has dash, you know that that's a state. I've also used data attributes, data state equals, and then you can have any states you want in there. And then JS hooks. We split those out because we run into problems if we're not aware that something is also being used in JS. The assumption is when we have a class that's a hook, it's being used in CSS, and we can change it if we need to. But when we add JS dash something, we know, no, this is needed for JavaScript. So there are various patterns. I mean, these are some of the ones that we might use, but you could come up with your own. So for a region, we often just use data region, and then we have a consistent pattern for naming all of our regions. For a component, I don't know, we go back and forth, but try to keep it consistent on a project. And you know, eventually I'll land on something that I like. But you know, is it a class, or does it actually get its own data attribute? And then elements, usually just a namespaced class. And for states, I like either data state or the is pattern. And for the JavaScript hook, we use JS dash. But again, you can come up with whatever you like, as long as your whole team knows it, it's consistent across the project, and you use it. And that's what matters. Then you can see what something is just by looking at how it's named. Whoa. Yeah, there's no right answer. But if you have no answer, that's totally wrong. So I'm going to look a little bit at some abstract patterns. This is one of the things that's interesting, I think, about what Sass has done to our design patterns. Is it used to be, well, in CSS, you can't represent the abstracts in any way. And so say you're using atomic design, atoms start with an A tag. In Sass, there's a level before that. There's something abstract before the A tag. There's variables, there's mix-ins, there's functions. And the variables are storing patterns that exist before we're even dealing with anything concrete. So how do we represent, this is just from a style guide, how do we represent this? We've got 3 brand colors, and we need to put those in code. How is that represented in code as a pattern? So one of the early ways to do it is this, and I think this is still really common and popular, is we have color variables. Some people namespace them with color, some people don't. And it's, you know, it's great, it's easy to access. We can say there we want a background that's this color. It'd be easy to manipulate with functions. Forced grouping is wrong, that's wrong. They're actually not grouped. They're only grouped to somebody that can read that and say, I know what this pattern is. But in terms of a machine readable way, these are not grouped in any logical way. So I would say that's a downside of this approach. The computer doesn't know, Sass doesn't know that these are all colors. Oh, forced? Oh, I see what I meant. Yeah. We're going to go on anyway. So I like using maps. It comes with its own problems. We'll look at those. But here, they're already namespaced, and now Sass knows that these are all part of the same system. And that's important to me because style guides, and we'll look at how I use that. It makes accessing them a little bit more complex if we just do it the simple way. You know, I have to use map get colors brand pink. That's not great. If you're trying to do other operations on the colors, you're adding in other functions there, and then you've got these nested functions, and maybe that gets ugly, so that's a downside. But it's machine readable, it's naturally grouped, it's all there. It also has this problem. If I define brand blue, and it's an HSL color there, and then I want to adjust brand blue to get my gray, I want a gray blue based on our brand color, I can't do that. Because the map doesn't exist at the time that I'm defining it. So I can't access the map yet. So I would have to create the map again. It just gets complex. It's not good. So we worked around that by using this approach where we define things now. We define what we'll want to happen, and then we don't execute them until you call the function. And we have our own color function that shortens that access point and also runs the operations that we've defined earlier. So instead of actually doing desaturate, we just say, I'm going to want this color, and I'm going to want to desaturate it by this much when we get there. When we get there, do that. And that's worked great for us. And it's actually, in my opinion, more readable in some ways. Looks a little bit like chained functions, and you can chain them together. So then we've got our own color gray. That's all in our accoutrement color toolkit. So you also get, we do some self-reference in the maps, as you could see. So we actually have layers of colors defined because we want sort of the real basic, just this is the color. And then we don't want to use those directly in our code because we want more semantic names for our code. So we'll say text is going to be what we've defined as black, and borders are going to be what we've defined as gray. And later on, we can change what gray is, and borders will update. Or we can change what borders are without touching gray. We can just say, actually, we want borders to be red now. So there's some trade-offs in that. And there's reasons for teams to go either way. I don't think it would make sense for a Lightning design system to use this sort of approach because they're not passing off Sass files to people. They're passing off something different, right? So we're handing off Sass files, and so building Sass patterns makes sense. Somebody that's handing off just class names doesn't have that opportunity, so they're going to build something different. It's part of this goal also is to make documentation the lazy option. This is one of my favorite things about having colors in maps, is it gets really complex to try to create a new color on the fly out in your code. And so people are forced to go back and look at the pattern and say, what colors exist here, and then create a new one in the pattern documentation already in order to get a new color. So they can see the list, and they can see that they're adding a new thing to the list, and it's documented right away. So I like that. Some people think it makes it more complex, and I think great. We were trying to figure out how to turn this into, so we've made everything machine readable. How do we turn it into actually a style guide without doing anything? Our team's small. We don't have a team dedicated to making style guides. That's nobody's job. It's all of us. We want it to come out of the documentation we're already doing. So we started building off of SassDoc, which is a great tool from Hugo Gerardel. And we just started expanding it. But you use inline documentation. KSS does this, a bunch of other document tools. This isn't the only option. We added some things to it. So we added a preview option there, preview color palette. And then we export our color palettes to JSON. I think Salesforce does the opposite. They have a JSON file or some sort of file with all the colors, and then they import it. So that works too. Just wherever you want to be defining the colors, make sure they're accessible somewhere else. And our generator automatically gives us a color palette. So there we have. Anytime we change anything in the map, this updates. And we have still a live style guide on our site. We do the same thing for sizes. So we can say we want text sizes to be, there's a root size, there's small, there's smaller. And again, we do the same thing. I can define ratios if I want to do modular scales. And then I can say make adjustments based on these ratios to give me new sizes, or I can just define the sizes I want. And then we do the same for fonts. Our fonts are defined in maps. So the machine understands them, and the machine generates all of the code we need. So once the computer has all this information, it can give us that information in various ways that we need it, like importing the web font, accessing the font, and creating a style guide for it, which we do. So we just output that information. The style guide generator takes all of the sizes that we've set our text sizes and all of the fonts that we've set our fonts on our site, and just automatically creates some patterns for us. And the toolkits are a byproduct. Toolkits are, we've worked out the pattern, and we've dried our code, and what's left over is a toolkit that gives us access to these colors and these sizes and these maps in these different ways. And we have those toolkits now, and we've made them available, but they may or may not work for you. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Build your own if they don't. In that, systems are better than just straight up solutions. The tool should fit you. You don't want to get a hammer that's like, no, this hammer only develops patio chairs. Like, that's crazy. You just want a hammer. You just want to hit something. And tools should work like that. Just, this is a tool for hitting things. What do you want to hit? So at one point, I was playing with these CSS-only tabs. And I kind of built a pattern around this. And it looked like this. It was kind of crazy. And then I tried to use it on various places, and I needed to change it every time I used it. And what I ended up with was this. What's essential? All that was essential about it was that it used an input to toggle something. And so finally, I got rid of that stupid tabs pattern and said, OK, all I have is a toggle pattern. That's the core of this. That's what's going to be useful various places. We use True for testing. There's other testing tools. We don't test, you can't test CSS perfectly with code. There are ways to test styles, but we just use this for functional unit tests. So when we're returning something, make sure that when we come back to it, if we make changes, we're still working. True gives results like this. We also lint our code. That's a way to make sure that the robots are doing the hard work of finding all of our typos, and we don't have to bug each other about white space, because that's annoying. So Sass lint returns something like this, and I have lots of warnings. I should fix that. So we can also look at some concrete patterns. I'm short on time, but let's do it anyway. HTML templates. I feel like this doesn't get enough attention. We use Jinja nunchucks. Those are basically the same language, one in Python, one in JavaScript. So we can render on the front or back end using the same syntax. That's true of some other templating languages too. I think that's really useful. But they're like preprocessors for our markup. And we give a lot of attention to how our preprocessors are designed for CSS and the best ways to use them. And I don't think that the HTML preprocessors get that same attention. I think it'd be useful. So we also build patterns here, and they work in very much the same way. We're trying to take something that's complex and simplify down what is the pattern, what's essential to it, what are the few things that can change. So instead of a lot of code about SVG, we want just icon wave, hello world. And then I think there's arguments about keeping logic out of templates. I think template logic is great because there are good reasons to take data and manipulate it for presentation. And I want to be able to control that in the presentation layer. So I'm all for it. I also think templates should look like templates. I don't like them being hidden in other things. So this is, just for an example, this is the icon from Lightning Design. And again, I'm not picking on them. They're doing it right for their users. But we would get to do this differently because we have that control. One thing that I would do is I take, anytime I see related classes that are part of a system, and I put them in their own system so that I can see that they're related. So I would do that here with they had SLDS icon text, various classes that were all based on that same input, and I would just break those out into data attributes. So I can see data icon color, I have these options. Data icon size, I have these options, and I've just broken those out of the global namespace and given them their own. And then I have this. I've got icon. I can pass it a few different, we've got a few variables that you can pass in to say you want differences in your icons, but it's pretty much simplified. So that's the final macro in Nunjux, and then that's what we're calling instead of the above. So again, we're just simplifying it and trying to give it some meaning. What does all this code mean? It means I want an icon that's the warning symbol. That's all it means. So then we get some, I'm out of time. So we also built into Herman. Herman is our theme for SassDoc, trying to add in StyleGuide tools. We built in some tools there to automatically generate a grid of all of our icons. So again, anytime we update icons, our StyleGuide updates automatically. We can automate a lot of this. With something more complex, this isn't hugely complex, but it's a real pattern that takes more pieces. We have a macro. You don't actually care what's inside of it, but we can call that macro. And then what? How do we document that? We don't have an answer. We're working on that. So maybe it's something where we do, this is trying to mimic how those Sass documentation, inline documentation tools work, but doing it in Nunchucks. Maybe that'll work. I don't know. Or maybe we need to do all that documentation in Sass, but tell Sass that it's connected to this macro. We want to somehow connect these two patterns and say these are part of the same pattern. Our Sass pattern is not separate from our template pattern. And then somehow, magic, hand waving, we'll get a style guide out of that, which we've failed a bunch of times. And it all started with, like somebody said earlier, it started trying to build style guides by hand, and they were always old, and that wasn't worth it. So we keep trying different things to get style guides to happen without us having a special team for it. And there's still work to do, but the important thing is that we're focused on the code patterns and making sure that those are there first. And that those patterns make things meaningful. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there are times when I've over-engineered things with Sass maps because it seems like a good idea and I go that direction, and then I have to pull it back. But I feel like
that was a good moment in the talk too. The pullback, the like the 900 line tabs function. That you're like,
yeah.
No, yeah,
right,
right.
Yeah, I do that with maps sometimes, and then I'm like, no. And then sometimes you get it right. Mm-hmm. You're like, okay, that's the way to use them.
Right. Yeah. It seems like that's been a thing in your development world for a while. Not that particular thing, but like engineering things in Sass to help you do.
Yeah, it's way more fun than building websites.
Yeah. Well, you found a niche there anyway. There's a delivering classes was a kind of a thing that you mentioned. I think a lot of people think of style guides in that way, or they can, which is like, I'm going to craft this perfect chunk of CSS and deliver it, and then and anybody who's consuming this style guide, I expect you to have the HTML be this way and use these classes, and then you get what you get. And that seems to be like kind of not how your brain works. It's kind of like almost bring your own HTML and then use my CSS as the style guide component. It feels kind of reverso to me. Yeah,
well, the way I was taught, the HTML comes first. Content and structure come first, and then we build the CSS around it, and so that's what I try to do. And I realize that doesn't work for all of the enterprise companies. Like there's times when that validly doesn't work as well. But I'm not dealing with those times. So I get to do it the way I like to do it.
Right, which is part of I work on a small team and I deliver what I deliver and are kind of known for that.
And the other thing is, if I do deliver classes, I want to create a pattern, a macro. I want to create a macro in my templates where the developers don't need to know what the class patterns are. They don't even ever touch those class patterns. They're built into a macro. They just say, I want an icon, and all those classes automatically appear. So nobody else has to learn that pattern. They just learn the abstraction.
Yeah. That's kind of related to those like Jinja functions or whatever
right.
you're talking about. Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's not talked about a whole lot. I can't say I've used it, and it makes me envious of it in a way. I kind of like that idea of like call a function right in my HTML and have it blast something out. Because, as I look at that like SVG output, which I'm a big fan of, I think that's a nice way to make an icon system. Maybe it won't be forever. Maybe in some weird world spans are cool again, and we need to do that. Now you can just update your function and you get that across your app, which is pretty nice, I think.
Yeah, it's worked great on our team. I mean, it used to be that I had various classes for creating buttons in specific ways, and the developers would always copy it wrong. Like, move something,
You'd think
change
copy
something.
and paste would be like a prereq
Yeah,
skill.
but you need to make one change. You need to make one change to it, and you get that change slightly wrong.
Yeah, right. It's error
And as
prone.
soon as we put it inside functions, they don't even have to worry about it. They just say, okay, I've got these 4 arguments I can pass in.
That's cool.
And it's much more reliable.
In your case, it was Jinja, but you literally could write. I mean, it just spits
Right.
out markup. It could be a
Yeah.
PHP include. It could be a
Yeah,
Rails
you could
partial.
do most of that with Mustache or
Sure.
React or
JavaScript
whatever.
side. Yeah, right on. There was one subtitle of one of your slides that said, "What did you think CSS was for?" Which I think this is kind of a meta conversation. Isn't the fact that we use cascading style sheets automatically a style guide in a way? It's like, what are we even
Yeah, that's what
talking
they
about?
are. That's what they are. Yeah, they're
Yeah.
a documentation of the patterns in your code.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like this, almost in a sense, from the front end perspective, this conference exists because it's like kind of not working, or like we need help. We need to talk about what we do with CSS more. Okay, no thoughts. Cool. Another point that hit home, I think, was the make documentation the easy way out. For example, I need a new color. Fine, add a new color, but the place that you add the new color is the same place that's generating the documentation. Or it's kind of like you're updating the documentation to give yourself that color.
And that's actually Claudina, who's talking tomorrow. She was working for us for a year, and she forced that on me. I was building that color system while she was there, and she kept saying, no, it has to not give me so many options out in the code. I want to always be forced to write the documentation first, and that's how I get access to it in the code where I need it.
Yeah.
And so I did that.
And you
It was
didn't-
her idea.
That's nice. You don't even have to say that, though. You could almost trick somebody into it. You could be like, just update it over here, and it just happens to be the place that updates the
Yeah,
documentation.
actually, my color function does take the same syntax, so you could do it on the fly. It just looks ugly, and we don't do it.
Yeah, and obviously you take documentation pretty seriously. I mean, that was one of your opening sentences, that if you don't document it, it doesn't exist in a sense.
Yeah,
Where
that
did
was
come
actually
from?
a problem that I had with Suzy early on, was I documented the easy parts to get to, and those are the least interesting part of Suzy to me. And it took me a while to realize that I have to stop documenting those shortcuts and start documenting what I think is actually good about the tool. Because people just didn't know that the functions in Suzy existed and you could use them to build your own grid system.
Oh,
And
right.
all that I did was document the pre-built grid system that was in there.
So
and the things
people
I didn't
think what you're
document.
delivering
Right,
is,
exactly.
is a pre-built grid, but really I feel like that click moment for the people that really get Suzy is that it's on-demand grids in a
Right.
sense, and that wasn't well documented at first?
That
or-
wasn't documented at all at first.
Oh, interesting.
And then people didn't get it. People didn't get why Suzy. And I was like,
Yeah,
oh yeah, I have to write it down for you. It makes sense.
sure.
Not
So,
everybody's going to read my code.
pretty good takeaways. Thanks very much,
Great.
Miriam. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.